The first one, Jim is fluent. That means he reads 120 words per minute when reading material that is written at a third grade reading level. And if Jim is at a third grade reading level, I would expect 120 words per minute would be a level of fluency. Another one, Susie can answer comprehension questions with 90 to 100% accuracy when listening to material that is based in her classroom. Notice here I did use a percentage, but I also told you what the material was that I was measuring, and that is material that is used in her classroom. Notice also that I said when listening to the material as opposed to reading the material. Here's another example. When interacting with peers, I give the setting, the context. Paul is quick to get into arguments using inappropriate language, and in parentheses, just in case we didn't understand exactly what inappropriate language was, I put the word profanity, and a loud voice. So the two behaviors, again, it's a description of the behavior, but it's a description that clearly helps anybody understand what the inappropriate behavior is. Here's some non-examples. Receives reading in the resource room. Well, that's great. Well, maybe that's a nice piece of information, but what does it really tell me about what the student can do? Or star reading 340. And by the way, these are real examples that were taken off of IEPs. I have no idea what star reading 340 is. I couldn't even tell you what that means, let alone a parent taking that home. Or the disability impacts progress in the general education classroom. Well, that's a very general statement, but how? Why? In what way? So these would be kind of things if you want to say, I may want to go back and revisit and make them a little more specific. Again, the present levels involves multiple steps. If we think of it as a two-step process, our part one process is simply describing what the student can do. That is based on the general curriculum expectations. Our part two then is a conversation where we're going to identify the gaps that are associated specifically with the disability. Because we know what the student can do in relation to the general curriculum expectations, now we can do the gaps. In this area, what we want to do, again, we have some questions that can guide the conversation. I really like to think about this as being more of a conversation that you're having with the team, or it might even be a conversation that takes place outside of the IEP itself, and then you're bringing the results of that conversation to the team meeting because you don't have as much time in the meeting itself to really explore this in the depth that you want to have a really solid IEP. So here are some kinds of questions that could guide this kind of conversation. Now, here's where you may want to take a little time to go. Make sure that you download or have downloaded that example of standards. I think we called it Any State's Reading Standards, and it's included in the materials for this module. These are fifth grade reading standards that we're using, and if you look carefully at them, the basic expectation in these standards is that students at the fifth grade understand text. They're able to read it and get meaning out of it. And different kinds of texts, literary texts, or good literature that's at a fifth grade level, or informational texts such as the science book or the geography book. So we get a good sense of what it is that the standards are asking for. Then, since we're looking at a student that has delays in reading, we have to ask ourselves, what are the prerequisite skills? What is it that is going to help a student be able to meet these fifth grade standards? So we want to go back to what we know about effective reading. And we know that we need to look at areas of phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, and orthography, which is writing. We will continue the analysis of these skills. Then where does a student demonstrate proficiency? Of the prerequisite skills, where is the student's performance? And we would look at formal reading assessments as well as informal reading assessments. Another question we would ask then when looking at those fifth grade standards would be, can the student achieve any of those expectations in the fifth grade class if they were giving an accommodation. For example, compare and contrast two ideas is one of the expectations. If the student were asked to compare and contrast something and they were given it orally, would they be able to do it if they didn't have to actually read it, but just asked to do that orally? That would tell us an important piece of information because it would tell us that the student has the ability to understand the language but can't read it. Or if they can't do either, they can't do it orally or they can't do it by reading, then that gives us additional information that there is a language or a vocabulary issue that would be a prerequisite skill to the student's success. So we need to look at these prerequisite skills in order to determine what the student can do. Then we want to be looking at if these are the responses to the questions. These are the skills that the student can do. These are the skills that are needed in order to be successful in this fifth grade. Then we have to ask ourselves, what skills need to be taught explicitly to this student? In other words, we can't take for granted that they're going to pick them up by an accommodation, but we need to step back and reteach or teach for the first time. And then which skills or knowledge might be acquired in the general classroom with an accommodation or an assistive device. This is an example of what it might look like when we put everything together that we've gathered. Here's Johnny. Johnny is in the sixth grade. He has a reading fluency rate of 120 words per minute when given passages written at the third grade level. He's able to read two-syllable nonsense words that follow common letter-sound correspondence with 100% accuracy. Describes what Johnny can do in terms of his reading ability. Johnny demonstrates understanding of grade-level materials when information is presented orally, including science, math, and social studies information. So it describes that he has some comprehension ability. Now we get into the interference of Johnny's skill with his participation. The requirement to read material at grade level interferes with Johnny's ability to perform proficiently or to expectations without support or adaptations. And we know that we can provide some adaptations in this instance, but to meet Johnny's goals for the future, continued intervention to develop independent reading skills is required because we really want Johnny to be independent. Now, this happens to be a reading example, but the same thing could be done with math. The same thing could be done in the area of social emotional, although in many state standards, it's often harder to find the behavioral expectations, but sometimes they're found in, say, health standards or PE standards. And if they're not there, then we have to look to the general classroom for the classroom standards that would take the place of the statewide standards. And we can also do the same thing in recreation, physical or vocational areas as well. So now's a good time for you to do some practice. You have a sheet that was provided that is kind of a practice sheet, and you can use the practice sheet, or you could use your own IEP, one of your own student IEPs. It doesn't matter. What I'd like you to do is to take a break and to use your own state standards. Use any student, and you can, if you're working by yourself and you're doing this on your own, you might do it by yourself. Hopefully you might have a coach that's working with you or a peer who's working with you, because I think this is the kind of thing that for practice sake is good to do in at least a pair. Maybe you're doing it as a team and working on it together. So use your state standards and any student that you choose. Review the standards for the grade level of that student. Make some notes on that IEP worksheet or make some notes on your own worksheet, whatever works best for you. Document what you know about the student's current skills and knowledge in the area that you've chosen. I'd encourage you to probably choose reading and math because those are the ones that we tend to see more often. And then conduct your data analysis using what you just learned in this process of reviewing for present levels of performance, and document that on the IEP worksheet that you have. And then when you're finished with that, come back and we'll start the next step.